Thomas Mitchell sat in the green room of the famous morning television studio, his hands shaking slightly as he held a cup of tea. At 68 years old, he never thought he would be on national TV. The old man wore his best suit, the one he saved for special occasions, and his military medal hung proudly on his chest. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors a soldier could receive. The producer had found Thomas living in a small apartment in London. His story had gone viral on social media after someone filmed him helping a homeless veteran on the street. The video showed Thomas giving his own coat to the shivering man and sharing his lunch. What people didn't know was that Thomas did this every day. He spent his pension money buying food and clothes for veterans who had nowhere to go. The studio was buzzing with activity. Camera operators moved around checking their equipment. Sound technicians tested microphones. The audience was filling up the seats, excited to see the show. Thomas had watched this program many times from his small living room, never imagining he would be sitting here as a guest. Whoopi Goldberg walked into the green room with a warm smile. She was even more impressive in person than on television. Her presence filled the room, and Thomas felt both nervous and honored to meet her. She sat down beside him and spoke in a gentle voice. "Thomas, I'm so glad you could make it today. Your story has touched millions of people around the world. Are you ready to share it with our audience?" Thomas nodded, his voice quiet but determined. "Yes, ma'am. I hope people understand why I do what I do. These veterans, they served our country with honor. They deserve better than sleeping on the streets." Whoopi studied his face carefully. She could see the pain behind his kind eyes. This man had seen things that most people could never imagine. She had interviewed many veterans over the years, and they all carried that same look of someone who had witnessed too much. "Tell me about your medal, Thomas. That's quite an honor you're wearing." Thomas looked down at the bronze medal with its red, white, and blue ribbon. His fingers touched it gently, as if it were made of the most precious material in the world. But his expression grew sad, not proud. "This medal represents the worst day of my life," he said quietly. "People see it and think it's something to celebrate. But every time I look at it, I remember the friends I couldn't save." The room fell silent. Even the busy producers and assistants seemed to stop what they were doing. There was something powerful about Thomas's honesty that commanded respect. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice soft and encouraging. "Would you like to tell that story today? Sometimes sharing our pain can help others understand." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He had never told the full story on television before. He had given brief interviews to local newspapers, but nothing like this. The thought of millions of people hearing about that terrible day in Afghanistan made his stomach turn. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "It's been 15 years, but it feels like yesterday." A young production assistant knocked on the door. "5 minutes until we go live," she announced cheerfully. Then noticed the serious mood in the room and quietly left. Whoopi stood up and extended her hand to Thomas. "You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with, but I want you to know that your story could help other veterans who are struggling. Sometimes people need to hear that they're not alone in their pain." Thomas took her hand and slowly stood up. His legs felt weak, but his resolve was growing stronger. He thought about all the homeless veterans he had met over the years. So many of them carried guilt and shame from their service. Maybe hearing his story would help them understand that even decorated heroes struggled with the same feelings. They walked toward the studio together. The audience was clapping and chatting excitedly. Bright lights illuminated the colorful set, and cameras pointed toward the comfortable chairs where they would sit. Thomas could see the teleprompters and the crew members wearing headsets, all working together to make the show run smoothly. As they reached the edge of the set, Whoopi turned to him one more time. "Thomas, whatever you decide to share today, just speak from your heart. Our audience can tell when someone is being genuine, and your honesty is what makes your story so powerful." Thomas straightened his shoulders and adjusted his medal one more time. He thought about his wife Margaret, who had passed away 3 years ago. She had always encouraged him to talk about his experiences, believing it would help him heal. She would have been proud to see him on this show, sharing his story to help other veterans. The floor manager began counting down. 10 seconds to live broadcast? The studio audience quieted down and everyone took their positions. Thomas sat in the guest chair, his hands folded in his lap. Trying to control his breathing, Whoopi smiled at the camera as the red light came on, signaling they were broadcasting live to millions of viewers around the world. She introduced Thomas with warmth and respect, explaining how his simple acts of kindness had inspired people everywhere. Thomas Mitchell is here with us today, a decorated veteran who has dedicated his life to helping other veterans in need. Thomas, welcome to our show. The audience applauded warmly as Thomas nodded to acknowledge them. He could feel his heart pounding, but Whoopi's encouraging smile helped calm his nerves. This was it, the moment that would change everything. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, something completely unexpected would happen that would stun everyone in the studio and millions of viewers watching at home. The interview began smoothly. Thomas spoke about his work with homeless veterans, his voice growing stronger as he shared stories of the people he had helped. He talked about Jimmy, a young soldier who had lost both legs in an explosion and was living under a bridge. Thomas had found him shelter and helped him get the medical care he needed. Jimmy was now married with 2 children and working at a Veterans Assistance Center. Whoopi listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions that helped Thomas tell his stories in detail. The audience was completely engaged, some people wiping tears from their eyes as they heard about the struggles these veterans faced after returning home from war. You mentioned that you use your own pension money to help these veterans? Whoopi said. That's incredibly generous, especially since many people struggle financially in retirement. Thomas shrugged modestly. My wife and I never had children. We lived simply and saved what we could. After Margaret passed away, I realized this money could do more good helping others than sitting in my bank account. These men and women sacrificed everything for our country. The least I can do is make sure they have food and a warm place to sleep. The camera captured the genuine emotion on Thomas's face as he spoke about his late wife. It was clear that helping veterans was his way of honoring her memory and finding purpose after her death. Whoopi noticed Thomas touching his medal unconsciously as he spoke about sacrifice. She had interviewed enough veterans to recognize the signs of someone carrying heavy emotional burdens. The medal wasn't just a decoration to him. It represented something much deeper and more complicated. Thomas, I can't help but notice that beautiful medal you're wearing. It's quite impressive. Can you tell our audience about it? Thomas looked down at the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest. His expression immediately changed from proud to troubled. The smile faded from his face, and he seemed to shrink back into his chair. This is the Distinguished Service Cross, he said quietly. It's supposed to be an honor. They gave it to me for what they called extraordinary heroism in Afghanistan. The audience murmured with respect and admiration. Many people stood up to applaud, recognizing the significance of such a prestigious military award. Thomas looked uncomfortable with the attention, raising his hand slightly to ask them to stop clapping. Whoopi sensed there was more to the story. You don't seem very happy about receiving such an important honor. Can you tell us why? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. The studio was completely silent except for the hum of the cameras and equipment. Everyone could see he was struggling with difficult memories. The day I earned this medal was the worst day of my life, he finally said. People see this and think I'm a hero. But heroes don't let their friends die. Heroes save everyone. I failed that day. Whoopi leaned forward with compassion in her eyes. Thomas, would you like to tell us what happened? Sometimes sharing these experiences can help other people who might be going through similar struggles. Thomas looked out at the audience, seeing faces filled with curiosity and support. He thought about all the veterans he had met who carried similar guilt and shame. Maybe hearing his story would help them understand they weren't alone in their feelings. It was 2009, Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. I was a sergeant in the British Army, stationed in Helmand Province. We were part of a convoy bringing supplies to a forward operating base. The intelligence report said the route was clear, but intelligence was wrong a lot in those days. The audience was completely focused on every word. Even the camera operators seemed to be listening more intently than usual. This was the kind of raw, honest testimony that people rarely heard on television. We were about halfway to our destination when the first improvised explosive device went off. It hit the vehicle in front of mine. Then the Taliban fighters started shooting at us from the hills on both sides of the road. We were trapped in what they call a kill zone. Thomas paused, his breathing becoming heavier as the memories flooded back. Whoopi quietly encouraged him to take his time, not wanting to push him too hard, but sensing he needed to tell this story. My best friend David was in the vehicle that got hit. He was unconscious and bleeding badly. The driver, a young kid named Peter, was screaming for help. There were 4 other soldiers trapped in that burning truck. The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Several audience members were crying, understanding that they were witnessing something very personal and painful. I had a choice to make, Thomas continued. I could follow orders and maintain our defensive position, or I could leave my post to try to save my friends. I chose my friends. Whoopi nodded encouragingly. That sounds like exactly what a hero would do. Thomas shook his head firmly. No, you don't understand. I saved 3 of them. David, Peter, and another soldier named Marcus. But I couldn't get back for the other 2. James and Christopher died in that truck while I was pulling out the first 3. They burned to death while I was being a hero. The weight of his words hit everyone in the studio like a physical blow. This was why Thomas couldn't celebrate his medal. This was why he spent his days helping homeless veterans instead of enjoying a comfortable retirement. He was trying to make up for the 2 lives he couldn't save 15 years ago. Whoopi reached over and gently touched his arm. Thomas, you saved 3 lives that day. That's not failure. That's extraordinary courage. But Thomas wasn't listening to her comfort. He was lost in the memory, tears forming in his eyes as he continued his story. The audience watched in respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing something profound and deeply personal. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. The memory of that day in Afghanistan was as fresh and painful as if it had happened yesterday. He could still hear the explosions, still smell the smoke and burning metal, still see the faces of James and Christopher as they called for help. After the fighting stopped and reinforcements arrived, they pulled the bodies out of the truck, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. James was only 19 years old. He had joined the army to pay for college. He wanted to be a teacher. Christopher was 22 and had a baby daughter at home. He carried her picture everywhere. The audience was completely silent, many people openly crying as they listened to Thomas's painful testimony. Whoopi had tears in her own eyes, but she maintained her professional composure to help Thomas tell his story. The commanding officer recommended me for the Distinguished Service Cross because I had saved 3 lives under enemy fire. During the ceremony, everyone called me a hero. They said I had shown extraordinary gallantry and devotion to duty. But all I could think about was James and Christopher. Thomas looked directly into the camera, addressing the millions of people watching at home. I want every veteran out there who's struggling with guilt to hear this. We all have friends we couldn't save. We all have moments we wish we could do over. That doesn't make us failures, but sometimes it feels that way. Whoopi nodded understandingly. She had interviewed many veterans over the years, and survivors' guilt was a common theme in their stories. Thomas, have you ever considered that maybe you were meant to save exactly the people you saved? Maybe David, Peter, and Marcus needed you more than you knew? I've thought about that, Thomas replied. David went on to become a paramedic. He's saved dozens of lives since that day. Peter became a counselor specializing in trauma therapy. Marcus started a foundation that helps wounded veterans. So maybe those 3 were meant to survive to help others. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance to the studio. Security personnel were speaking quietly with someone who appeared to be trying to enter. The cameras remained focused on Thomas and Whoopi, but everyone could sense something unusual was happening. Whoopi glanced toward the disturbance, then looked back at Thomas with a slightly puzzled expression. This wasn't part of the planned show, and live television always made unexpected moments more challenging to handle.
Thomas?
I think we have a surprise visitor, she said, trying to maintain the flow of the interview while acknowledging the interruption. Hey. tall man in an elaborate red military uniform was walking onto the set. He wore the distinctive bearskin hat and ceremonial dress of the Queen's Guard, the elite soldiers who protect British royal residences. His appearance was so unexpected and formal that the entire studio audience gasped in surprise. The guard walked with perfect military precision directly toward Thomas, his polished black boots clicking against the studio floor. His face was serious and determined, showing no emotion as he approached the interview area. The cameras quickly adjusted to capture this dramatic and completely unplanned moment. Thomas looked confused and slightly alarmed. He had no idea why a member of the Queen's Guard would be appearing on an American television show, especially during his interview. Whoopi was equally puzzled but maintained her professional demeanor. Ready to handle whatever was about to happen, the guard stopped directly in front of Thomas and came to attention with a sharp military bearing that commanded instant respect. The studio was so quiet that everyone could hear the ceremonial sword at his side settle as he completed his formal stance. "Sergeant Thomas Mitchell," the guard said in a crisp British accent that carried clearly throughout the studio. His voice was strong and authoritative. Trained through years of military discipline, Thomas automatically straightened in his chair, responding to the military formality with his own ingrained sense of discipline. Even after 15 years as a civilian, the habits of military service remained strong within him. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice stronger than it had been during the emotional parts of his interview. The audience was completely captivated by this unexpected turn of events. No one knew what was happening or why this ceremonial guard had appeared during a routine talk show interview. The tension in the studio was electric, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Whoopi looked back and forth between Thomas and the guard, her experienced interviewer, instincts telling her this was going to be a moment that television audiences would remember forever. She gestured for the cameras to capture every angle of what was unfolding. The guard reached into his ceremonial jacket with deliberate, practiced movements. He pulled out an official-looking envelope sealed with red wax and bearing what appeared to be a royal coat of arms. The envelope was clearly very important and formal. "Sergeant Mitchell," the guard continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of British military tradition, "I have been instructed to deliver this message to you personally." On behalf of Her Majesty, Thomas's eyes widened in shock and confusion. He looked at Whoopi, then back at the guard, trying to understand what was happening. The audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something historic and deeply meaningful. The guard extended the envelope toward Thomas with both hands, treating it with the reverence reserved for the most important military communications. Thomas reached out with trembling hands to accept it, clearly overwhelmed by the formality and significance of the moment. What happened next would change Thomas's life forever and leave everyone in the studio, including Whoopi herself, completely stunned by the power of recognition and redemption. Thomas held the official envelope in his trembling hands, staring at the royal seal with complete bewilderment. The weight of the paper felt substantial, and the red wax seal gleamed under the studio lights. He had never received anything from the royal family before, and he couldn't imagine why they would contact him now. Especially during a live television interview, the guard remained at attention, waiting for Thomas to open the message. His presence was both intimidating and respectful, representing centuries of British military tradition and honor. The entire studio audience leaned forward in their seats, desperate to know what the envelope contained. Whoopi was experiencing the kind of television moment that veteran hosts dream about. This was completely unscripted, genuinely surprising, and clearly very meaningful. She could see the confusion and emotion on Thomas's face as he struggled to understand what was happening. "Hey, Thomas," she said gently, "I think you should open it," with careful reverence. Thomas broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper inside. His eyes scanned the formal document, and as he read, his expression changed from confusion to absolute shock. His hands began shaking even more violently. Tears started flowing down his cheeks. The audience watched in complete silence as Thomas struggled to process whatever he was reading. Some people were crying just watching his emotional response, even though they had no idea what the message contained. "Would you like to share what it says?" Whoopi asked softly, recognizing that this was clearly something very significant and personal. Thomas looked up at her, then at the cameras, then back at the document. He seemed almost unable to speak, overwhelmed by the contents of the royal message. When he finally found his voice, it was barely audible. "It's from Buckingham Palace," he whispered. "It's signed by the Queen herself." The audience gasped audibly. Even in America, people understood the significance of personal communication from the British monarch. This was clearly something extraordinary and unprecedented. Thomas cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "Sergeant Thomas Mitchell. It has come to our attention through the testimony of the soldiers whose lives you saved in Afghanistan, and through the accounts of the many veterans you have helped in civilian life, that your actions have exemplified the highest traditions of military service and human compassion." The studio was completely silent, except for Thomas's voice, as he continued reading the royal message. Every word carried the weight of official recognition and profound respect. "Your Distinguished Service Cross was awarded for extraordinary heroism under fire. But our recognition today extends far beyond that single act of courage. For 15 years, you have honored the memory of your fallen comrades through your selfless service to veterans in need." Thomas paused, clearly struggling with the emotion of the moment. The guard remained at perfect attention, his presence lending even more gravity to the proceedings. Whoopi had tears streaming down her face as she realized the significance of what was happening. "We have received detailed accounts from David Harrison, Peter Williams, and Marcus Thompson, the 3 soldiers whose lives you saved. Each has written to us describing not only your heroism that day, but your continued friendship and support in the years since. They credit you not just with saving their lives, but with teaching them the meaning of true service." The audience was now completely captivated, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical television interview. This was a moment of profound recognition and healing for a man who had carried guilt and pain for 15 years. Thomas continued reading, his voice becoming more emotional with each word. "We have also received testimonies from more than 40 homeless veterans, whose lives you have transformed through your compassion and generosity. They describe a man who gives freely of his time, money, and heart to ensure that no veteran faces hardship alone." Whoopi wiped her own tears, realizing that this message represented validation that Thomas desperately needed to hear. For years, he had seen himself as someone who had failed his comrades. Now he was learning that his actions, both in Afghanistan and in civilian life, had been noticed and appreciated at the highest levels. Therefore, Thomas read, his voice now strong and clear, "It is our honor to invite you to Buckingham Palace to receive additional recognition for your extraordinary service to others. Your actions embody the finest qualities of military honor and human decency." The studio erupted in spontaneous applause that continued for several minutes. People were standing, cheering, and crying, all at the same time. This was recognition that went far beyond medals or ceremonies. This was acknowledgement of a life dedicated to serving others. The guard stepped forward and spoke again, his formal tone carrying new warmth. "Sergeant Mitchell, I am also instructed to tell you that the families of James Crawford and Christopher Davies, the soldiers who died that day in Afghanistan, specifically requested that this recognition be delivered to you. They want you to know that they have never blamed you for what happened. They consider you a hero who tried to save everyone." Thomas broke down completely at these words. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of survivors' guilt, believing that the families of his fallen friends must hate him for not saving their sons. Learning that they actually considered him a hero was more healing than any therapy or medication could have provided. The guard continued with his message, delivering words that would change Thomas's understanding of himself forever. "James's mother asked me to tell you that her son wrote about you in his last letter home. He called you the bravest man he had ever known and said he was honored to serve alongside you." The guard's words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. James had written about him in his final letter home, calling him brave. For 15 years, Thomas had tortured himself with the belief that he had let his friends down. They might have died thinking he had abandoned them. Now he was learning that James had actually admired and respected him right up until the end. Whoopi could barely contain her own emotions as she watched this. profound moment of healing unfold before millions of viewers. This was why she loved doing television. Sometimes, in the midst of entertainment and celebrity interviews, real life broke through with moments of such power and meaning that they changed people forever. The guard wasn't finished with his message. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a smaller envelope, this one with different handwriting on the outside. "Christopher's father also asked me to give you this. He wrote it himself after hearing about your work with homeless veterans." Thomas accepted the second letter with shaking hands. The audience watched in complete silence as he opened it and began to read the handwritten note. His tears flowed freely as he absorbed the words that Christopher's father had written specifically for him. "He says that Christopher would be proud of what I'm doing," Thomas said through his tears. "He says that helping other veterans is the best way to honor the memory of the friends we lost. He doesn't blame me for what happened. He thanks me for trying to save his son." The emotional weight of the moment was overwhelming everyone in the studio. Even the camera operators and sound technicians had tears in their eyes as they witnessed this extraordinary act of forgiveness and recognition. This was healing happening in real time, broadcast live to millions of people around the world. Whoopi finally found her voice again. "Thomas, how does it feel to learn that the families of James and Christopher don't blame you? That they actually see you as a hero?" Thomas looked up at the cameras, speaking directly to the veterans he knew were watching at home. "For 15 years, I've carried guilt about that day. I thought I was a failure disguised as a hero. I thought the families must hate me for not saving their boys. Learning that they don't blame me, that they're actually grateful for what I tried to do, it's like a weight has been lifted from my soul." The guard stepped forward one final time. "Sergeant Mitchell, I have one more message to deliver. This one comes from the 3 soldiers whose lives you saved that day." Thomas looked surprised. He maintained friendships with David, Peter, and Marcus, but he had no idea they had contacted Buckingham Palace about him. The 3 men had built successful lives after their military service. But Thomas had never connected their success to his actions that day in Afghanistan. David Harrison, now a paramedic in Manchester, asked me to tell you that every life he saves is dedicated to your memory of James and Christopher. He says you taught him that heroism. It's not about being not perfect. It's about doing everything you can, even when you can't save everyone. Thomas nodded, remembering conversations with David about the challenges of emergency medical work. David often talked about cases where he couldn't save patients despite his best efforts. Now Thomas understood that David was dealing with similar feelings of guilt and responsibility. Peter Williams, who works as a trauma counselor in London, wanted you to know that he tells your story to every veteran he treats for survivor's guilt. He says your example of turning pain into service has helped dozens of men and women find purpose after losing friends in combat. This revelation stunned Thomas. He had no idea that Peter was using their shared experience to help other veterans. The thought that his story of loss and redemption was helping other people heal from similar trauma was both humbling and inspiring. Marcus Thompson asked me to deliver the most important message of all, the guard continued, his formal voice carrying deep emotion. He says that the foundation he started for wounded veterans exists because you showed him that survival comes with responsibility. Every veteran his organization has helped represents your commitment to honoring the friends we couldn't save. The audience was completely captivated by these revelations. They were learning that Thomas's heroism extended far beyond that single day in Afghanistan. His influence had rippled through the lives of the men he saved, inspiring them to dedicate their own lives to helping others. Whoopi looked at Thomas with profound respect and admiration. "Thomas, do you realize what you've accomplished? Not only did you save 3 lives that day, but those 3 lives have gone on to save and help hundreds of other people. Your courage has multiplied exponentially through their work." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing this new understanding of his impact on the world. He had always focused on the 2 lives he couldn't save, never considering the broader implications of the 3 lives he did save. Now he was learning that his actions had created a chain reaction of service and compassion that continued to grow 15 years later. The guard straightened to attention one final time. "Sergeant Mitchell, Her Majesty specifically requested that I convey her personal gratitude for your service, both in Afghanistan and in your civilian work with veterans. She considers you an exemplary representative of British military values and human decency." Thomas stood up slowly, his legs unsteady but his posture becoming more military as he processed the full significance of what had just happened. The Queen of England had personally recognized his service and sent as a member of her personal guard to deliver the message on live television. The guard executed a perfect military salute to Thomas, who instinctively returned it with the precision that comes from years of military training. The sight of these two soldiers, separated by generation and circumstance, but united by service and honor, created one of the most powerful moments in television history. The entire studio audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. People were crying, cheering, and clapping with an intensity that reflected their understanding of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a moment of profound healing and recognition that transcended television. Whoopi stood as well, her own emotions overwhelming her professional composure. In 30 years of broadcasting, she had never experienced anything quite like this. The spontaneous appearance of the Queen's Guard, the royal recognition, and Thomas's emotional journey from guilt to redemption had created television magic that couldn't be planned or scripted. As the applause finally began to quiet down, Thomas wiped his tears and looked out at the audience with an expression of wonder and gratitude. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't carrying the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. The families of his fallen friends didn't blame him. The Queen herself had recognized his service. Most importantly, he now understood that his survival had purpose and meaning.
Thomas,
Whoopi said, her voice thick with emotion. "What are you thinking right now? How do you feel?" Thomas took a deep breath, composing his thoughts carefully. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying none of the pain and hesitation that had marked his earlier words. "I feel like I can finally stop apologizing for being alive," he said simply. "For 15 years, I've felt guilty about surviving when James and Christopher didn't. I thought I didn't deserve this medal or any recognition. But today I learned that surviving isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to make meaningful." The audience listened in respectful silence as Thomas continued to process his transformation. The guard remained at attention, his presence lending continued gravity to the moment. "I want every veteran watching this to understand something," Thomas said, looking directly into the cameras. "We all have friends we couldn't save. We all have moments we wish we could change. But carrying guilt doesn't honor our fallen comrades. Living with purpose does. Helping other veterans does. Using our survival to make a difference does." Whoopi nodded, recognizing the wisdom that comes from pain transformed into purpose. "Thomas, what will you do with this new understanding?" Thomas smiled for the first time during the entire interview, his face lighting up with genuine joy and determination. "I'm going to keep helping homeless veterans, but now I'll do it with a different heart. Before I was helping them because I felt guilty about my survival. Now I'll help them because I understand that my survival was meant to serve a purpose." The guard stepped forward one final time. "Sergeant Mitchell, Her Majesty expects you at Buckingham Palace next month for the ceremony. The families of James Crawford and Christopher Davies will be there as well. They specifically requested to meet you in person." This final revelation brought fresh tears to Thomas's eyes. But they were tears of joy and anticipation rather than pain and guilt. The thought of meeting the families of his fallen friends, of seeing acceptance and gratitude in their eyes, instead of blame and anger, represented the completion of his emotional healing. "I'll be there," Thomas said firmly, "and I'll wear this medal with pride for the first time in 15 years. The audience erupted in final applause as Whoopi concluded the interview. But the story was far from over. Within hours of the broadcast, donations began pouring in to support Thomas's work with homeless veterans. The 3 soldiers whose lives he had saved appeared on television to share their own stories of how Thomas had inspired their careers in public service. Most importantly, hundreds of veterans called hotlines and visited counseling centers, inspired by Thomas's story to seek help for their own survivors' guilt and trauma. His televised journey from pain to healing became a catalyst for other veterans to begin their own process of recovery and redemption. The Queen's Guard had delivered more than royal recognition that day. He had delivered healing, hope, and the understanding that survival comes with responsibility rather than guilt. Thomas's story became a beacon of light for veterans, struggling with the weight of loss and the challenge of finding meaning in their survival. 6 months later, Thomas stood in Buckingham Palace receiving additional honors from the Queen herself. Beside him stood the families of James Crawford and Christopher Davies, their faces filled with gratitude and respect for the man who had tried so hard to save their sons and had spent 15 years honoring their memory through service to others. The ceremony was broadcast around the world, showing millions of viewers that heroes aren't people who never fail. Heroes are people who turn their failures into purpose, their pain into compassion, and their survival into service. Thomas Mitchell had become the embodiment of that truth, proving that sometimes the most powerful redemption comes not from forgetting our losses, but from transforming them into our life's work. The Distinguished Service Cross still hung on his chest, but now it represented something different. It wasn't a reminder of failure or guilt. It was a symbol of the responsibility that comes with survival and the power of turning tragedy into triumph. Thomas had finally learned to wear it with the pride it had always deserved.